this episode, we move from what happens inside the organization to what happens when personal data leaves your direct environment. Because external sharing is one of the most visible and highest-risk parts of privacy management. Beginners often hear the word sharing and think it always means selling data. But most external sharing in real organizations happens for ordinary operational reasons, like using a cloud provider to host an app, a payroll provider to pay employees, or a support platform to answer customer questions. Even when the reason is normal, the privacy risk comes from losing direct control, adding more hands that can touch the data, and increasing the number of places where copies can exist. Governing external sharing means knowing who receives data, why they receive it, what role they play, and what happens if they pass it along again. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain external sharing governance using the concepts of processors, controllers, recipients, and onward transfers, and you should understand how those labels drive real operational controls. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. External sharing begins with a basic idea. Not all outside parties relate to your data in the same way, and privacy law often treats them differently based on their role. A processor is generally a party that processes personal data on behalf of another party and under that party's instructions, such as a vendor providing a service that requires handling your customer data to deliver the service. A controller is generally a party that determines purposes and means of processing, meaning they decide why and how data will be processed, either alone or jointly with another controller. A recipient is a broader concept, often meaning any party to whom personal data is disclosed, which can include both processors and controllers. These terms can feel abstract, but they matter because they affect who is responsible for what contracts are required, what notices must say, and what rights the individual can exercise with which party. Operational governance begins by classifying external relationships correctly, because misclassification leads to missing controls and misleading transparency. Many vendor relationships in modern organizations are processor relationships, but beginners should not assume that every vendor is a processor just because you pay them. Some services act as controllers for their own purposes, even if they also provide a service to you, and some can be joint controllers in certain configurations. For example, an advertising platform may decide how it uses data to deliver and optimize ads, which can make it a controller for that processing, while a simple email delivery provider may act more like a processor when it sends messages under your instructions. The key is not to guess based on brand or category, but to examine who decides the purpose and key means of processing in the relevant context. Governance requires making that determination and recording it, because it drives contract terms, disclosure obligations, and how you respond to data subject requests. When you treat a controller like a processor, you may promise deletion or control you do not actually have, which becomes a defensibility problem later. Once roles are clear, governance focuses on purpose and minimum necessary sharing, because external sharing should be limited to what is needed for a defined use. If a vendor only needs email addresses to send notifications, sending full customer profiles is unnecessary and increases risk. If a payroll provider needs tax identifiers for employees, that does not justify sharing unrelated performance notes or health information. The principle of minimum necessary becomes even more important externally because every extra field shared is an extra exposure point. Operationally, this means defining data sharing scopes per vendor, not just saying the vendor gets access to our data. It also means designing integrations and data feeds to avoid dumping whole tables when only a few attributes are needed. A mature privacy program works with engineering, procurement, and system owners to reduce data shared by default and to make the shared dataset intentional. Contracting and due diligence are the central governance tools for external sharing, because contracts translate privacy expectations into enforceable obligations. For processors, contracts typically require the processor to process only on documented instructions, to keep data confidential, to implement appropriate security, to assist with rights requests, to notify about incidents, and to manage subprocessors with oversight. For controllers and recipients, contracts may focus more on permitted uses, restrictions on reuse, security expectations, and responsibilities for notices and rights. Due diligence, which is the assessment you perform before sharing, evaluates whether the recipient is capable of meeting these commitments, such as whether they have reasonable security practices and stable processes. Beginners sometimes think due diligence is just paperwork, but it is a risk control that prevents you from handing personal data to a party that cannot protect it. Governance also requires revisiting due diligence periodically because vendors change their products, their subprocessors, and sometimes their practices. Onward transfers are where external sharing becomes more complex, because the party you share with may share again, such as when a processor uses subprocessors or when a controller discloses to additional partners. In processor relationships, subprocessing can be normal, like a cloud provider relying on infrastructure providers, but it must be governed. A strong program requires visibility into subprocessors, the ability to object or approve changes where required, and contractual assurances that subprocessors are bound by similar obligations. In controller relationships, onward sharing may be part of the controller's business model, and your governance must ensure you understand and disclose that reality to individuals when required. The practical reason onward transfers matter is that they expand the chain of custody and the set of entities that might hold copies of data. If you cannot track onward transfers, you cannot accurately answer questions about where data went or coordinate deletion and rights fulfillment. Cross-border transfers are often part of onward transfers, and they can introduce legal requirements beyond ordinary contracting, especially when data moves between jurisdictions with different protections. Even for beginners, the operational concept is straightforward. If personal data is transferred to another country, you may need an approved transfer mechanism and additional safeguards depending on the applicable law. Governance here includes knowing where vendors store and process data, which is not always obvious, and ensuring that contracts and technical configurations align with your intended data residency choices. It also includes being transparent in notices about international transfers when required, because people may care deeply about where their data is processed. The Privacy Program Manager's role is to ensure external sharing decisions consider geography as a normal part of vendor risk, not as a surprise discovered during an audit. Defensibility improves when you can show you assessed transfer pathways and implemented appropriate safeguards intentionally. External sharing governance must also integrate with security controls because privacy promises fail quickly when security controls are weak. When data is shared externally, you need to consider how it is transmitted, how it is stored, who can access it, and how access is revoked when no longer needed. You also need to consider whether the recipient can support your incident response needs, such as timely notification and cooperation. Contracts set expectations, but technical controls like encryption, access restrictions, and logging are what protect data in practice. A mature program aligns privacy requirements with vendor security assessments so the organization does not approve a vendor for privacy reasons while overlooking security weaknesses. This alignment matters because many privacy incidents originate from third parties, and the public often holds the original organization responsible regardless of who caused the breach. Governing external sharing, therefore, includes ensuring the recipient's security posture is appropriate for the sensitivity and volume of data shared. Transparency is another operational requirement, because external sharing affects what you must tell individuals and what they expect. Notices should describe categories of recipients and purposes of sharing in ways that match reality, and where laws require more detail, the program must provide it. Transparency also includes making sure internal teams know what commitments have been made publicly, because marketing or product teams might propose a new sharing arrangement that conflicts with notice statements. When a person submits a rights request or complaint, your ability to respond depends on knowing which vendors receive their data and in what role. This is why vendor registers and data flow maps are not just governance artifacts. They are operational tools for real interactions with individuals. If you cannot answer who received the data, you cannot fulfill the spirit of transparency, and you may be unable to comply with legal disclosure obligations. Rights fulfillment across external parties is a practical stress test of governance because it reveals whether contracts and operational channels are strong enough. If a person requests deletion and the data is held by a processor, you may need to instruct the processor to delete and confirm completion within your timeline. If a person requests access and some of the data is in a vendor system, you may need the vendor's help to retrieve it and format it securely. If the recipient is a controller, you may need to explain to the individual which party is responsible for that processing and how to exercise rights with them, depending on law and arrangement. These workflows require predefined contacts, standard request templates, and tracking mechanisms so you are not scrambling to find the right person at the vendor when a deadline is ticking. Governance is successful when rights operations feel routine and coordinated rather than chaotic and slow. External sharing governance also includes making deliberate decisions about disclosure outside of vendors, such as disclosures to partners, affiliates, professional advisors, or authorities. For example, sharing data with an auditor or legal counsel might be necessary for compliance, while sharing data with a business partner might be part of a joint offering. Disclosures to government authorities can raise additional concerns about legal authority and scope. A mature program defines categories of external recipients and the conditions under which disclosures are permitted, including required approvals and documentation. This prevents informal disclosures like someone emailing a customer list to a partner because it seemed helpful. The principle is the same as internal governance, but with higher stakes because the data leaves your environment. Sharing must be purposeful, limited, authorized, and recorded. Monitoring and review are the last pieces that keep external sharing governance from becoming outdated. Vendors change their products, add subprocessors, move infrastructure, and update terms, and business teams add new tools faster than governance can keep up if there is no ongoing process. A strong program has a way to detect new vendors and new data sharing pathways, such as tying procurement to privacy review and scanning for unsanctioned tools. It also includes periodic reviews of high-risk vendors, checking that contracts remain current, that subprocessor lists are reviewed, and that data sharing scope has not expanded silently. When changes are found, the program updates notices, updates internal records, and adjusts controls. This ongoing monitoring is what turns governance from a one-time assessment into a living capability that matches how organizations actually operate. As you wrap up this episode, remember that external sharing is not inherently bad, but it is inherently consequential because it expands the chain of custody and the potential for misuse or loss. Governing external sharing means correctly classifying external parties as processors, controllers, or other recipients, and then using that classification to drive contracts, controls, transparency, and rights operations. It means sharing only what is necessary for defined purposes, designing integrations to limit exposure, and managing onward transfers so you know when data is passed to subprocessors or other parties. It means considering geography and transfer safeguards when data crosses borders and aligning privacy governance with security expectations so third-party risk is managed realistically. When these controls and approvals are clear and enforced, the organization can collaborate with vendors and partners confidently while still honoring the promises it makes to individuals about how their data will be handled.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.